Welcome everyone to the launch of PodPoll 25. It's Australia's most comprehensive survey of Australian podcast listeners. PodPoll 25 delves into the listening habits of Australians aged 15 plus. And the platforms that they use. I know people are talking a lot about platforms and consumption on those platforms at the moment, so we'll have some data for that today. Look, PodPoll 25 also really identifies some untapped opportunities. So if you're a media house, a brand, a non-for-profit, a government agency, there's some clues in today's data about the places you should be playing if you're wanting to seek new audiences and engage with people with your messages. It really shows why, if you haven't thought about a podcast in your suite of activities, much like you do a newsletter or a website or your social media activities, you really should be thinking about it in 2025. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our First Nations elders past and present, of course, the first storytellers on the land in which we gather, and podcasting now a new form of storytelling. So I'd like to acknowledge any First Nations peoples in the room today and really welcome you along. I'm Kellie Riordan. I'm the director of the podcast production house Deadset Studios, and I've been working in podcasts since 2005. Before anyone had an iPhone, and I invented a little podcast called Conversations, which is still going some 20 years later. So I've launched more than 50 shows as the head of podcasts at the ABC and now running Deadset Studios. I'm going to hand over to Leanne White now, who's PodPoll's co-author. Leanne is the managing director of market research firm Insightfully, and Leanne's just going to walk us through the methodology for the report before we jump into the data.
Thanks, Cal. Super excited to release this new track of PodPoll, especially since podcasting really continues to mature here in Australia. So as we have done in previous years, we conducted the survey in two parts. So first, we measured consumption habits among a very large and representative sample of more than 3,700 Australians 15 years and over. And then we reduced that sample size to still a quite large 1,638 regular podcast listeners to take a deeper look into their listening habits. Now, we define regular podcast listening in the same way that most other surveys of this type do, that is, as someone who's listened to a podcast in the past month. Now, before we dig into the data, just for those who were joining in the second half of that first minute who might have missed Kel's little intro there, we are going to be doing a bit of a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So we're looking for questions from you. So as we go through the results of PodPoll 25, you can use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Don't pop it in the chat, but use the Q&A function to drop your question in. We'll talk you through the insights for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions.
So last year, 8.2 million Australians, or 39% of us, listened to a podcast each month. In 2025, 47% of Aussies, so that's 9.6 million of us aged 15 and over, are regularly consuming a podcast. And when you factor in rounding out, that's a rise of 7 percentage points in the last year. It is even higher for those in the younger demographics, of course, who are really tuning in big numbers now. Monthly listenership amongst 25 to 34-year-olds is now at 69%. So that's more than 2 out of 3 people in that group regularly listening. Across the genders, listening by men has risen by 41% last year to 50% this year, up 9 points. Listening by females was at 38% last year and has gone to 43%, so up 5 percentage points year on year. So we've seen a bigger increase in men listening year on year than women. Podcasts, as I mentioned, definitely a favoured medium for the younger digitally native generation. So again, if you're a marketer, a brand, you're trying to reach those younger audiences, podcasts are a pretty powerful way to capture that demographic. And of course, they provide a way for you to spend a lot, or those people to spend a lot of time with your message. So across the younger demographics, half of Gen Z was tuning into podcasts in 2024. Now 58% of them are listening, so that's an increase of 8% year on year. 56% of millennials were listening last year, and now 66% of them are listening, so that's an increase of 10%.
Now, turning to the more mature demographics, in 2024, 38% of Gen Xers were regularly listening to podcasts. Hooray for the Gen X. That's up 6 points this year to 6 points to 44%. And boomers have seen a year-on-year increase of 4 points, up to 27% of them now regularly listening.
So importantly, that means that in every single generational demographic, podcast listening has risen year on year.
Yeah. So we continue to look at how podcast listenership is growing compared with other types of audio listening. And podcasting shows the biggest growth of all audio categories. So we've already seen how podcast listening is up 7% over the past 12 months. So podcasts are the audio category that's had the most growth. And you can see here that music people own or stream has remained steady at 75% of Australians regularly listening. Music radio is steady at 72%, and so is listening to news or talk radio. Audiobook listening is the only other audio category that has grown over the past year, but you can see there that it's off a much lower base than podcasts.
We also look at how often people listen to podcasts. In 2024, a quarter of listeners were tuning in every day. This year, daily listening is up from 25% to 29%, so that's up 5 points. And that equates to 8.2 million Australians now listening to a podcast each day. So there's more listeners overall this year, and they're also listening more often. Of course, as the proportion of daily listeners grows, the proportion of weekly and monthly listeners has dropped slightly. That makes sense. So it's really becoming a more regular habit for lots of people. It's now mimicking that daily radio habit that so many people have. And while the daily habit has increased across the board, it has increased more amongst male listeners. So women are stronger in the weekly category, so that's in the middle there, while men dominate daily listening. So that's those bars you see to the right on screen. In terms of the breakdown of different demographics, millennials and young parents are some of the demos most likely to be listening daily to podcasts. Also of interest, 47% of people who listen to branded or owned podcasts, so they're happy to listen to a show from a brand they're interested in, listen daily. And purchasers, so people who say they would make a purchase after listening to a podcast, are also more likely to be daily listeners.
We also take a look at how many hours a week people are listening. The majority are listening between 1 and 3 hours a week. That's up 2 points since last year to 54%. And the number who are listening a lot, so over 10 hours a week of podcast content, has gone up marginally to 5%. That's more than 480,000 Australians who are listening to 10 hours or more of podcast content every week. And a bit of a surprise for us this year, when we looked at which demographics were listening more than last year, in that most popular 1 to 3 hour band, some of the biggest increases were seen among blue collar workers, which was really interesting to us. So the blue collar workforce includes a wide range of jobs that might be hairdressers, food trade workers, animal handlers, cleaners, drivers. It's not only men, but it is a group who is dominated by men. And the number of blue collar workers listening 1 to 3 hours a week has gone up a significant 13 points now to 57%. So a huge increase in podcast listening among that group. Now, those might be people for whom radio in the workplace or in the vehicle used to be really commonplace, but it's clear now that they're finding content that they're interested in from podcasts.
So as well as the number of hours they listen, we of course also ask people how many episodes they listen to across a week. The biggest shift in those is in those listening to between 2 and 4 episodes a week, so 50%. For those listening to 1 or fewer episodes, that's gone down slightly. So you can see that there's this continued shift from a few years ago where people might listen, to 1 episode maybe once a week, to the current situation where more people are listening to podcasts overall. They're listening more regularly or daily, and they're also listening to more episodes as well. The number of people listening to 5 to 9 episodes a week has remained steady. There's also about 10% of listeners who are super fans. So these are the people who consume 10 or more episodes a week. So that's a lot of hours of content that people are hoovering up each week.
Yeah, excellent. So people often ask Kellie and the production team how long to make an episode, how many minutes will keep the audience engaged. And year on year, if you look at the middle bars, you can see there's been a slight increase in the number of people listening to episodes of 15 to 30 minutes, at least once a month, up 5% to 81%, and 30 to 60 minutes up now to 84%. But if you take a look at those outside bars, the biggest increases have come from the number of people listening to the hyper short and the hyper long episodes. So for episodes under 15 minutes, listening is up 11% now to 64%. And for those long form podcasts of more than an hour, listenership is up 7 points to 65%. So nearly 2/3 of listeners are now listening to really short or really long episodes. And how often do they get to the end of those episodes, though? We still have 77% of people finishing an episode always or most of the time, and it's even higher for millennials, 79% of whom finish an episode always or most of the time.
And I think that those high completion rates are one of podcasting's greatest strength, especially in the age of the scroll, swipe, move on. So on social media, people might scroll past a TikTok video or a reel in 3 to 4 seconds, and that's great for brand awareness, etc. But podcasts are really the deep engagement medium. So because of that opt-in, I chose this content, it's tailored for my needs and desires, we tend to find that people have gone through all of those kind of barriers and hurdles to find the content. Once they make that commitment, they then tend to stick with most of an episode. So podcasts are really the high engagement piece. One of the things we look at each year is what is the job a podcast is doing for the listener? What purpose does it serve? Why is someone choosing that podcast? And it's no great surprise, perhaps, that 62% of people tell us that one of the top 3 jobs a podcast is doing for them is to keep them entertained. And that doesn't necessarily just mean a comedy, a gag a minute sort of a podcast. It just means that people seek out those entertaining, compelling shows that have plot and character and scene and really keep people gripped. Those shows that have entertainment values. 53% of people say they want podcasts to help them relax. I guess we're seeing the rise of celebrity chat shows. So it's people wanting to escape their busy lives, listen to something kind of just easy, relaxing, escape from that sort of quite dire news cycle that we're seeing right now. And 41% of people told us that they choose podcasts that are relevant and useful to their life. So this idea of utilitarian content, shows that help people do something or learn something in their life in a really useful way. One of the podcasts we make at Deadset Studios is called Hold the Moment, and we make it with Dementia Australia. And it really is a podcast that helps people understand the steps they need to go through once they receive a diagnosis. So it's that idea of a person choosing that content because it's relevant and useful, and it's that just-in-time content for them. Podcasts, of course, are the popular medium because audio is still the thing that you can do while doing something else. It's hard to consume a long-form video or a long-form New York Times article while you're out riding your bike. Half of PodPoll 25 respondents are relaxing while listening, and almost 40% of them are behind the wheel when they're consuming a podcast. 36% of people are now exercising while listening, and that's up 3% from last year. So that's 3.5 million Australians who say they're exercising while listening to a podcast. And nearly 30% of people use podcasts to, pass away the time while they're doing those mundane household chores. But let's just head a little bit deeper into this data. And we can see that while 52% of regular podcast listeners are relaxing while listening, adolescents are the demographic most likely to be chilling out while consuming a podcast. Nearly 40% of people are driving while listening, but young parents, well, it's nearly 50% of them who are behind the wheel while listening to a podcast. And even more again, 60% of blue collar workers who are in the car while listening. Again, probably makes sense, tradies in their car. I mentioned 36% of listeners are exercising while consuming a show, but it's higher for millennials at 42% and higher for men. And 57% of business owners are there in that statistic as well. Now, again, if you think about those leadership shows that really appeal to business people, shows like Diary of a CEO, or maybe Straight Talk or The Mentor from Mark Bouris, those are shows that people are listening to while exercising. Sadly, of course, and this is the third year in a row I've had to say this, so I hope this data changes over time, but it's particularly women and particularly millennial women who are most likely to be listening while doing household chores.
So for regular PodPoll followers, you'll know that it's really important to us to understand the broader context in which people are listening to podcasts. So what else is going on in their lives? What do they care about? And how can that actually help us shape and prepare podcasts that are relevant and useful to people? So when we asked people what issues in Australian society they were most concerned about right now, 75% told us they were concerned about some aspect of the cost of living. Beyond this huge cost of living cluster, climate change and the environment are also important issues for people, mentioned by 22% of podcast listeners. But while cost of living concerns are up 5 points since last year, environmental concerns are down 5 points. And now I want to draw your attention to that third bar there, the 20% of podcast listeners who are concerned about the availability of housing. And the number who are worried about this lack of housing supply is up 7 points since last year. That's the biggest increase of any issue. So let's now dig into that 75% who mentioned cost of living to see how that breaks down. So as you can see here, 51% mentioned the general cost of living, but 27% told us they were specifically concerned about the cost of housing. And when we couple that with the 20% concern for housing supply that I just mentioned, we can see that 47% of mentions overall are about housing. So housing is the single biggest issue concern for people. So how can podcast makers leverage these findings about what people care about in their day-to-day lives? Why is this important to you as podcast makers? Well, if you're working in finance or how to run a household budget, or if you're working in housing development or tackling the homelessness crisis, if you're interested in climate change, if you want to help Australians unpack any of these issues, podcasts are a really good communication tool to do that. So these findings will help you understand how to commission podcasts that go beyond those top-of-line headlines that we see in the paper to really dig into the weighty topics for Australians. And of course, sometimes there's variations in how certain demographics view societal issues. What was really interesting to us this year is that on climate change and the environment, concern is fairly equal across the generations, and over-indexing on concern for climate change and the environment are homeowners and professionals. And daily listeners, people who listen a bit more regularly, are more likely to be interested in environment and climate issues. People who listen to 6 6 episodes or more a week are also more likely to be concerned about those environmental topics. So a really great opportunity for environment groups and organisations to harness that top line concern that people have to really dig into these issues and break them apart for people. For cost of living, millennials are more concerned than other demos. And on housing affordability, remember we mentioned just how big of an issue that is as well. It's more important to those middle age brackets, Gen Zs, millennials, and Gen Xs.
Okay, one of the data points that people are really interested in and want to dig in with PodPoll is what genres people are listening to. We always ask respondents, what type of podcast have you listened to in the past month? And in 2025, comedy and news podcasts are the most preferred genres. True crime, of course, is still very popular. Listening to health and well-being podcasts is up from 5th place to 4th spot. The society and culture category is down 2 places to 6th. Sport has moved up this year. It moves up from 6th to 5th, which again, when you couple that with the fact that more men are listening this year and they're listening more often in 2025 as well, it makes sense, of course, that sport podcasts have increased in listenership. Kids and parenting towards the right there, it's still a niche genre. Its listenership has nearly doubled now to almost 1 in 10 podcast listeners. And that growth in the kids and parenting genre is really driven by young parents, of course. But let's just zoom in on the top 11 genres. So in the yellow, we see what people told us they had listened to in the past month. But we also asked respondents which type of podcasts or which genres would you be interested in listening to in the future? Well, in the blue, you can see that there's this incredible appetite for more content. And this is particularly true in certain genres, which I'll go through in a minute. But, you know, people still ask me a lot, is this whole podcast market saturated? And this data says absolutely not. There is still headroom, still room to grow, still room for more titles. But in particular, for health and well-being, while a quarter of people are currently listening to that genre, almost half would like to. In lifestyle and leisure, again, it's more than double the amount who have listened that would like to in the future. And history, there is so much headroom in this category, so much desire for new history content. 18% of listeners told us they'd heard a history podcast in the past month, but more than double that, 40% would like to.
And again, it's always worth remembering, as we said earlier, different demos have differing desires for types of content. So some really good examples here: 35 to 54-year-old women, more likely to listen to health and well-being. Young parents are driving the interest in lifestyle and leisure, maybe that desire to get away and relax a little bit, perhaps with the young family. And middle-aged men and upper blue-collar workers are among those who are preferring that history content, which Kel just said has such an opportunity to grow.
All right, platforms. It's the thing everyone's talking about this year. So let's just recap on where everything sat last year, because I think it's helpful for you to understand the trend year on year. So Spotify dominated last year. 58% of people were using that platform to listen to a podcast. And Apple was just below that at 28%. But this year, the picture looked very different. YouTube is catching up. While Spotify is steady year on year at 58%, YouTube has jumped right up. So 44% of listeners told us that they use this platform to consume podcasts. Apple Podcasts is actually losing listeners. Some of the smaller apps also had increases. So Audible was up a little, iHeartRadio and Listener up a touch. Those still quite small percentages in comparison to the top big 3 players. I will just point out though, the question that we ask is, what platforms do you use to listen to a podcast? So this data doesn't even really factor in all the people who are now watching a podcast on YouTube. Of course, many of you've seen of what's happened in the last week with Taylor Swift going on the New Heights podcast with Travis Kelce. So some people are listening to it on YouTube, some people are watching it on YouTube, some people are listening to it on a listening platform. But definitely what we can say is YouTube is something that everyone should be thinking about.
Now, despite there being around 6 million podcast titles out there, people are still sampling new shows. So the podcast market's not saturated yet. And remember, there's billions of videos on YouTube. So 6 million podcast titles is actually not that many. 55% of regular listeners in Australia are trying a new podcast title at least once a month. That's up from 43% last year. So trying new titles much more often. Younger listeners are more eager to try new content, as well as men, professionals, upper blue collar workers, and young parents, all groups that are looking for that new title that will interest them. So, we've almost got to keep serving up this new bit of interesting content for people to try.
And how do people find those podcast titles? Well, 26% of respondents told us that they discover podcasts via social media, and 20% of people trust recommendations to put them on to new podcasts. People also search for topics. They scroll through podcast apps. They might read a review to find a new show. But the age demographics most likely to hear about podcasts via social media, of course, are Gen Z. 41% of them finding their podcast via social. It's 51% of people aged 18 to 24 that discover via social. So you do need a really good social media game wrapped around your podcast, particularly if you're going after younger audience. Lower blue collar workers are also likely to discover via social media, 39% of them using social media for discovery. Professionals are likely to pay more attention to recommendations, and it's parents who also trust recommendations to find new shows.
So here's what I love about podcast listeners. They're so much more engaged in the world around them than people who don't listen to podcasts. So podcast fans really lean into the content. It's not a passive medium. In every personality category, podcast listeners over-indexed compared to the general population. Podcast listeners are really big learners and sharers in particular. The heaviest podcast listeners are more likely to be learners, eager for new knowledge and skills, which matches well with that earlier insight about shows that are relevant and useful and which help people learn something being quite desirable for them. They're also more likely to be opinion sharers who like telling their friends and family what they really think, as well as activists who take action to support causes and issues that they care about.
We also ask people what they do after listening to a show, and it's quite remarkable to me the way that podcasts fuel a subsequent action. So, after listening to a podcast, 44% of listeners will tell someone about that show. So, that's such a powerful word of mouth amplification. 42% will search for a topic, a product, or service after listening, and 38% will be your advocate, and 16% will make a purchase. Now, a great example of both this searching for something and making a purchase after listening to a podcast is one of the better branded podcasts that I think I've seen lately, and it's a show called Unpolished. The premise is, well, if men can network on the golf course, then why can't professional women network at a nail salon? And so Unpolished it's an interview show of unfiltered conversations with female leaders. And the whole interview takes place with the host and the guest while they get a manicure. So they have this interesting chat about leadership and business and the workplace. But at the start of the show, they mention the OPI nail polish, the color that they've chosen to put on their nails. And it's shot for video too, so it's in this groovy nail salon, so it works for both mediums. But honestly, look, after listening, it is possible that I did indeed search for an OPI nail color, and I did indeed make a purchase. So it's a very, very clever way to sort of fuel someone towards an action.
And I just want to dig into that 16% who take action for a cause or purpose. That's really interesting to me. So if we break that down, 11% of podcast listeners have spoken to a friend or family member about something they heard on a podcast. 5% joined a group or activity. 5% donated money as a result of listening to a podcast. 5% signed a petition, and 2% took a really effortful action of attending a rally. So that's more than 193,000 Australians who got out there into the world to attend a rally in real life after listening to a podcast. So it just shows you how much podcasts can really spark activism. And we're getting to the end here. We've just got a few slides for you to go. And I just want to impress upon you to pop some questions in that Q&A chat. You've got direct access to Kellie Riordan, one of Australia's foremost podcasting experts. So don't let the opportunity go to waste.
So this idea about brands and government agencies and not-for-profits all now having a podcast in their arsenal in the same way that most brands have, a newsletter and a social media account is definitely worth unpacking, because we're noticing more and more that these owned podcasts provide incredible value to a brand, actually, because listeners are tuning in for many hours, not minutes, and they will share your podcast afterwards or search for your services. So this year we asked people about both branded or owned podcasts and about those traditional radio style ads you hear at the start of a podcast. So branded podcasts are entire episodes and series that are created by an organization, a business, or a brand about stories related to their particular services or products. Now, these branded series are most relevant to Gen X, young parents, and those in managerial roles. Interestingly, people who say they'll make a purchase after hearing a podcast are much more likely to find a branded podcast relevant. In podcast advertisements are those more traditional short radio style ads that I said. So they're often 30 or 60 minutes. They're played at the start of a podcast, or a host reads them. And they might not be directly related to the episode content. So those ads are more relevant to adolescents, Gen Z, and those on upper middle incomes. There are, of course, plenty of Australians who have great recall on both types of advertising and say that both types of content are useful to them.
Oh, me. Thanks, Kel. So there's so many reasons to be creating podcasts in 2025. If you'd like a free copy of PodPoll 25, there's a QR code on your screen there that you can scan. And that downloadable copy has a few extra insights in it for you as well. And it also contains the full methodological statement, so you can see just how rigorous PodPoll is.
So if you've got a question for us right now, please use the Q&A function to ask that question. We're going to stick around and answer some of those questions for you. So we're really keen to make sure that we've asked and, had a look at those questions. I think we might go firstly to a question from Kate. It says, with the increase of podcasts being filmed, at what point does a podcast just become a video? Or as some have put it, bad TV? Yes, I've seen a lot of those. How do you find a balance, and what should be the priority? So that's a really good point. I think that, people are getting very excited about video, which is all good and well, and it's something that we're seeing growing. But there's two types of podcasts. So there's podcasts that are just two people sit in a chair, they have a conversation, it's barely edited, that can be filmed for both video and podcast and put out on both platforms. However, there is still a place for those very built, curated, edited, scaffolded shows that might have multiple voices. It might be a documentary. It might include pieces from the field. It is much harder to turn that experience into a full-blown video piece. So what we often recommend is, that doesn't mean there's not people listening to those things, and it doesn't even mean that there's not people listening to those on YouTube. It just might be that they find that podcast on YouTube, they put it onto their smart TV, and they're just listening in the background. So they're using YouTube like it's a radio. So there's definitely an approach for both, and it really depends on who your audience is and what you're trying to achieve. We have a question about the research methodology for you, Leanne.
Yep, happy to take that. And I love to see methodological questions in there, because it's fantastic that people are really stress testing the rigor of polling that is out there. As a pollster of more than 20 years, I know just how important it is to be really, really accurate and transparent with your rigor. So if you go to the QR code, you can download the full deck, which does go in depth about our methodology. But just to recap the highlights for you, so essentially our large survey, our survey of Australians to measure listenership, is over 3,700 people. That has a margin of error of plus or minus 1.5%. So really, really narrow band of error margin on that top line listenership stat. We're really confident in how accurate that is. What we do with our sample, we've been doing this for years now, and as I said, Insightfully's been polling for years as well. Beyond just having a large sample size, there's a couple of other things that you want to do. You want to apply really robust quotas to make sure that your sample is representative of the Australian population, and we do that with a number of interlocking quotas on things like age, gender, and location. We also post-weight the data to reflect the Australian population based on Australian Bureau of Statistics stats as well. I know, Tim, I saw you popped a question in there. Thank you so much for that, about whether it passes the sense check that 1 in 2 Aussies are podcast listeners now. Yes, we're very, very confident in our PodPoll results. You say there that our number matches some of the other podcast measurement surveys that are out there, but it doesn't match others. I think the thing to measure is, I can't speak for the methodology of other surveys, but I do know that some of them are measuring slightly different groups. So, for example, we do podcast people 15 plus, some others do Australians 12 plus. So if you want to check out our full methodology statement, just have a download of the full deck there.
We have a question from Carmel. My question's about the popularity of comedy pods. Are these podcasts personality presented, like Smartless, Amy Poehler's podcast, or high concept comedy shows? Look, both. We don't specifically ask people to sort of break that down, but what we tend to see is when people answer kind of, I like a comedic podcast, they can like everything from some of those really great BBC comedy panel shows, like The Infinite Monkey, I think it's called, things like that work really well. But we also see comedy and other genre mashups. So it might be comedy and football put together. It might be comedy and fashion put together. So yes, there's definitely a rise in those comedian-led, personality-led shows. Shows like Smartless, technically speaking, Jason Bateman and co are not comedians, but of course people say they are funny. They are 3 actors who are humorous and have a bit of fun with their guests. So I think it would be a combination of all of the above. So Matthew has a question: for not-for-profits and charities, producing a decent podcast costs money. Yes, it does. Especially to do a high professional job. How should organizations get involved without breaking the bank? That is a really fantastic question. I would say that it's really about thinking where you can win, what your organization has to say that nobody else is saying, the access that you have to guests and expertise that no one else has, and then just create a series that's only that long. Like, not everything has to be a weekly show, 50 weeks a year. People are getting very confused about that, because they're saying to me, "Oh, Kellie, everyone's listening daily or weekly." That is true, but they're listening to lots of different things. And also, the hunger to pump out more content comes from the ad revenue that sits behind more regular content. But if you're a not-for-profit, you're not pumping ads into your podcast necessarily. For you, your measure of success is actually not ad revenue. It's, have we got to the right audience? So again, I come back to the Dementia Australia example. because that Hold the Moment podcast is aimed at people with dementia or their families, which equates to a couple of million Australians a year. Their measure of success is that podcast getting to those people, and is it helping them deal with dementia? So if your measure of success is that, make a short run series, 5 episodes, put a big marketing campaign around that. It doesn't have to be 30 episodes. So there is still a way that those smaller organizations can tackle podcasting for sure. Alison Brown from UNSW says, will there come a time when we can actually understand who is listening to our podcast? Alison, I'm as frustrated as you by this. We all have frustrations about the limit of the analytics, particularly, I guess, if you compare it to some social media. So in the back end of Spotify and Apple or whatever CMS you're using, you can get some information about males versus females, geographics. In some apps, you can get age breakdowns, etc. But yes, of course, everybody in the podcast industry is a little frustrated that the analytics aren't getting better. I think they will over time as technology evolves, AI fixes it. So I don't think it will be long before we see that change. Any other questions?
There's a question in there from Martin Kell about, can we further segment the areas, issues and types of history that people are wanting?
Not specifically with this data, because we just say history. But what we can tell you is a couple of things in terms of what's trending on charts and on the downloads around what sorts of history shows are getting the downloads. So things like telling a story that happened in the past and retelling it for today's era is very popular. So things like Stuff the British Stole that Mark Fennell does. The Rest is History from Goalhanger in the UK. You're Wrong About, which is a show out of the US, is another great sort of history show that tells you about a pop culture moment from the past. Why did the Dixie Chicks get cancelled when they made some comments about George W. Bush on stage? And they kind of go back to 1994 or whenever this happened and retell the story. Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History was a very early successful podcast in the history category. But again, I would say history blended with another genre. So comedy and history, where a lot of comedy or comedians are getting involved in kind of history podcasts. It might be the history of sport, and then you're going after those male listeners. So there's opportunity to kind of cross collaborate history with another genre as well.
All right, that was so good, Kel, to have everybody dialing in and checking out PodPoll 25 today.
So if you go to the website deadsetstudios.com/podpoll, there is a downloadable insights deck for you. So you can download that for free. Lots of insights. As Leanne mentioned, there are many extra pieces of data in there as well. And we also have a poll at the end. So we'd love to know if you found this useful, what you'd like more of, what you'd like less of. So if you would participate in our poll, that would be really great as well. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.